Soldiers of Christ arise and put your armor on. Strong in the strength which God supplies. Strong in the strength which God supplies through His beloved Son. Strong in the Lord.
We are in Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16 this morning. Good to see everybody. We got a lot of folks still traveling, vacation type of situation. Some of you are back. We are very glad that you are back. I hope that you're gaining some things from this particular study. I've enjoyed it. I was just thinking, and Libby and I were talking about our classes, and we're over halfway through the book of Acts, taking one chapter each week. But I hope that one of the things that this class is doing for you is encouraging you to continue to read in these chapters, because obviously there's a lot we're not covering. There are so many lessons here by doing a chapter each Sunday that we are just not having the time to deal with. So I hope that's helping. Also, how are we doing on getting an idea? Do you feel like that we're better equipped to know what's in each chapter and to deal with it? I hope so. My goal was for us to at least try to put in our minds a thought from each chapter, and I know that can be challenging when you're going through it. But what I have found is that if I review that, every week, and just thinking, okay, what's chapter 1, and what's chapter 2, and work my way through it, I do pretty good in keeping that in my minds and thoughts. In fact, what I've done a few times, I've used this idea in a gospel meeting in the Sunday school hour, just basically taking a thought from each chapter, and I've done it in light of evangelism, something from each chapter that had to do with evangelism in the church, and at least it's helped me. So I encourage you to think about that. We back up a little bit and get us to the point that we're at. We've noted that with chapter 13, Peter pretty much is gone out of significance as far as the writing of Luke, and Paul has become the major figure. Also, we were introduced to him back in chapter 9 as Saul. But now, from chapter 13 on, pretty much, he's going to be referred to as Paul the Apostle. And also in chapter 13, up to that point, Luke had mentioned Barnabas and Paul or Saul. And now that is reversed. Now it's Paul and Barnabas. And, you know, to me that just says a lot about the way that they would handle things, whoever was the prominent person. But it also says a lot about Barnabas too. Barnabas was the kind of person, it seems, that playing second fiddle, that was fine. You know, he went to Tarsus and got Saul and brought him over to Antioch. And that's how he really got involved in Antioch and thus got involved in the missionary journeys. And the two of them were very, very powerful as a power in preaching the gospel. In that first journey, chapters 13 and 14, they established some 6 different congregations. And we noted that in coming back, they came back through these cities and strengthened the congregations. They also went about appointing elders in these particular congregations as well. So comforting them and strengthening them. When they got back to Antioch, this brings us to chapter 15, there were certain Jews that were insisting that people also keep the law of Moses as well. Speculation as to whether they had been brought in particularly to do this, whether or not that was their intention all along. And we've talked quite a bit about the transition that these folks were having to make from the law of Moses to the New Testament covenant, and how difficult that had to have been, especially for the older folks, to make this transition. They had this sort of driven into them since they were children. The importance of the law, the importance of the 10 Commandments, the importance of respect for Moses. And now they're being asked to make this transition to the new covenant and to their allegiance not to Moses or to Abraham, but to Jesus Christ. So that struggle continues. And not only does it continue through the days of the New Testament, but likely even beyond that. Before you go too far into history, these folks are going to die out, those that had been raised on the law of Moses. And you would think that the situation would have gotten better with the teaching and the preaching that was done. We noted that there were likely those that continued to keep the Sabbath because it always kept the Sabbath. And they could do that as long as they did not teach or as long as they understood that that was done away with. That they were not to bind that observance on anybody else. And they were also to understand that now it was the first day of the week. But I suspect that there were those that they just could not bring themselves to work on Saturday because they had that, just driven into them. And that was all right. If they wanted to keep Saturday as well as Sunday. The Apostle Paul says that we're free to keep any day, Monday, Tuesday, if we want to set those days aside to pray, to meditate, to study, as long as we understand and realize that that's not something that God binds on us, and we really have no right or authority to bind that on anybody else. So in chapter 15, they dealt with that. Paul and Barnabas and others, they went down to Jerusalem, and they had what we call the Jerusalem Conference. And they came out of that with the understanding that circumcision and other things was no longer binding, and they couldn't force that on people. And so the Gentiles now were being welcomed in, although there were still those that were struggling with that, and we'll see that as we continue to study the book of Acts. So the last few verses of chapter 15 we find that we're ready now to start on the second journey. And that's basically what we have here in Acts 16. And we talked a little bit about this last week, that there was a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas about John Mark. And we went back to chapter 13. We noted that on that first journey, John Mark had gone with them, but for some reason at Perga, he had decided to go home. We don't know if he got homesick. We don't know. Maybe it was a lot rougher situation than he thought it would be. They were traveling a lot. Paul later talks about the fact that there were times when they were cold, and times when they were hot, and times when they were hungry. All sorts of things, and their lives were threatened, and they were beaten at times. They were cast out of cities. There was a jail threat. So who knows? But in verses 36 through 41 of chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas can't agree on this, and we noted from scriptures, Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and about verse 11, that later John Mark was working with Paul, and Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy, he said, you bring John Mark, because he's useful to me for ministry. So a lot of lessons there. One, I think we see that Paul, and we don't know why he didn't want John Mark, it would appear to me that maybe the most plausible answer is that he felt that this work was so important, so vital, so essential, that he wanted people that would stand by it. He didn't want somebody that was going to give up and quit in the middle. On Barnabas' side, Barnabas saw something in John Mark, and we know that what he saw was to come to fruition. He saw that here was a worker, yes, he did quit, but he won't quit this time. And that seems to be exactly what happened in hindsight, looking back at it. But we also know that even though there was a sharp disagreement over an area of opinion, Paul and Barnabas both handled it real well. Paul selected Silas. Now you have another worker. And they go, in verse 40, in one direction. And in verse 39, Barnabas takes John Mark and goes to the island of Cyprus, which is where Barnabas originally was from, going back to Acts chapter 4. So now you have two groups. We don't know where Barnabas and John Mark went from there, whether they did their work there or they traveled. But now we switch off to Paul and Silas, and we find them coming to Derbe and Lystra in Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. Comments, questions? Anything that I've rambled on about this morning or from last week as well? You know, one of the interesting things to me, the Bible is just a wondrous book. And pretty much anything that we can imagine or think about, it deals with in one way or the other. Here it's just a good example of how we handle disagreements over matters of opinion. Now, we're not talking about doctrine. In Acts chapter 15, we dealt with both opinion and doctrine. And we see that the authority was in the Spirit of God. It was in the apostles who were led by God, inspired of God. And what they determined there was then written for us so that we would know that's from God. Here we find a disagreement, and we find two men that disagree very sharply. So much so that they went their different directions. But we don't find them saying anything ugly about either one. We don't find either one of them quitting and saying, okay, if y'all going to act that way, and if you're going to treat me that way, if you're not going to do what I want, I'll just quit. The Bible helps us, if we'll just look at it, to know how to deal with disagreements, with church fusses, whatever it may be, and sets the example for us. And we find that kind of in amongst the dealings of evangelism, and how that these folks were real people. They had feelings just like we do. And they had disagreements just like we do. And so we find, I think, very good examples here of how to deal with some of those things. Anybody with a comment, thought there? Okay, Acts chapter 16 is just filled with interesting things and happenings. The conversion of Lydia and her household, and in the latter part of the book, the story of the Philippian jailer. And one of the things that I have done over the years in studying with people about salvation and trying to encourage someone to be baptized and become a Christian is simply to go to these different examples and to study with them these particular cases, going back to Acts chapter 8 and some of the work of Philip, an Ethiopian eunuch, chapter 9 with Saul, chapter 10 with Cornelius, and then coming particularly here. And I think as you would think about talking to people, we would be greatly benefited by looking at these different examples and looking at how Paul and Silas went about their teaching and their preaching. So the journey begins in Antioch of Syria, and verse 1, we're actually back up to verse 41. It's interesting that as they started this journey, they went back and visited some of the congregations that they'd already established, strengthening the brethren. A good admonition for us there. There is the tendency for us sometimes when people obey the gospel to give them a great deal of attention and encouragement, and we kind of flock around them when they're baptized into Christ, but maybe don't follow that up with words of encouragement and further teaching. We need to have a program, but we also need, I think, as individuals, to realize and understand that it's just like a newborn baby. They have to have continued attention and encouragement in order to remain strong. So these new churches, these new congregations, Paul and Silas are going back through them to encourage them. It's also interesting. It says, then they came to Derbe and Lystra. Lystra, you may remember, that's where Paul had been stoned and left for dead. Interesting that he went back, isn't it? I don't know if I'd done that or not. I think I would have maybe had to think a little bit. Do you want to go back where they stirred up a mob and tried to kill you? Thought they had killed him, it appears. But Paul had a great confidence in the Lord, in the Lord's care, in the Lord's providence. So he went back there in order to encourage those folks as well. Also, it is at Lystra that Timothy comes into the picture here. It says, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, or your Bible may say Timotheus, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. The mention of his father probably is brought in here to explain why Timothy had not already been circumcised as a Jew, because his father was not a Jew. We find later that Paul had him circumcised, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. But his mother evidently was committed to the law of Moses and had taught Timothy and had taught him well. And now he is in a position here to where the Apostle Paul wants him to go with him, and Timothy does. In 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 2, Paul refers to Timothy as his son in the faith, an expression that was used in reference to the fact that it is likely that Paul taught and Timothy was either baptized by Paul or by somebody in that particular group. It also tells us that he was well thought of. he was in verse 2, he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. So Timothy had already developed a reputation as a young man, and so he was in a position, it seems, to become a missionary and to go with Paul. We know that his mother and his grandmother both are mentioned in the Bible. This also, I think, says a lot about them. It was somewhat unusual for the women to be mentioned at all with the culture that they lived in. But 1 Timothy, I guess it is there, both his mother and his grandmother are listed giving praise, I think. It's in 2 Timothy, rather, chapter 1, in reference to the work that they had done with this young man. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, so Paul wanted him to go with him, verse 3, took him and had him circumcised. And that's interesting because it had just been established back in chapter 15 that circumcision was not to be bound upon anybody. And here we find a situation that I think has a good lesson for us. Paul recognized and understood that in order for them to go into the Jewish synagogues without causing a great mob disruption, Timothy needed to be circumcised so that he would be accepted in there. Now later, with Titus, there were those that insisted that Titus be circumcised for religious reasons, and Paul refused. He said, no way are we going to do that, to show that that was not essential in order for a person to go to heaven. Timothy, though, was circumcised because Paul also understood that it would solve a lot of problems. They wouldn't constantly be forced to fight the battle of these Jewish brethren who were struggling with making this transition. So, what does that tell us? I think, Paul on one occasion said, I become all things to all men. There are times when the culture needs to be observed in order for us to be able to teach and preach. Now, we don't obey culture per se because we're commanded by the Bible to do that. But if the customs are not sinful, we're sort of cutting our own throat if we don't obey those customs when we go into certain parts of the world. And that seems to be the answer in reference to what Paul was doing here. Anybody with a thought there? Yes. Well, it appears that there was a transition period of time. Of course, when the church had its beginning in Acts chapter 2, then that was over with. You go back to Genesis chapter 17, and you find that circumcision was basically for the descendants of Abraham. And that came in to the law of Moses, which came along later. So it was something that was practiced all the way back to Genesis chapter 17. At this point, it's not right or wrong. It was a family thing. And of course, circumcision is still practiced today because of health reasons. But not, I don't know if anybody practices it today. Does anybody know? Do the Jews still practice circumcision today as a religious thing? I don't know. I hadn't even thought about that as far as it still being a practice today. But what was happening was that the teaching was showing that the law of Moses was done away with. Now, did some of these people struggle with that? Yes. How long? I suspect some of these early Christians struggled with it as long as they lived. And yet the teaching from Acts 15 proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was not something that you could bind on people without that being a sinful situation. So, I suspect to get into those Jewish synagogues that it was something that probably by the lifetime of Timothy, and yet if you still had those that were holding to the old law and still sticking with the synagogues, I would suspect that that went on for quite a long time. But what happened was, as churches were established, you didn't have to go to synagogues anymore. Where, as we have observed, that was a ready-made audience. They were going to come together on the Sabbath, and Paul and others used that as an opportunity. How long did they continue to do that? I don't know. There might be some historians that would give us a little bit of an answer there. But as congregations were established, now you had a place to go and a place for people to be invited to. And so it would have faded out, I would assume. Good question. Don't know. Anybody with a thought there? The other. Yep. Yeah, exactly. It was just to keep from having to argue maybe for days over that principle. And so just to avoid that, then, and I think that wherein, if it's not a right or wrong issue now, in his teaching, I'm sure even in the synagogue, Paul came to that point. And of course they had the letter that had been written, you remember, and was taken back from that Jerusalem conference to Antioch. And no doubt that letter was written and it was spread. So Paul didn't neglect to teach that that was no longer a part of what you had to do to be saved. And no doubt that wasn't received real well by some individuals. But we know that a lot of folks were baptized and became Christians, so obviously the transition was taking place. How long? I don't know. Anybody else with a thought there? It just shows, I think, Paul could have been stubborn and said, okay, it don't matter no more, we're not doing it. But he was wise enough to know that this was something that could be done, as Sonny points out, move them way down the road as far as being able to teach rather than having to fight that battle right up front. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, now the timing, I think. It's in Galatians 2, where they were trying to insist that Titus be circumcised. And later it may have just given the wrong impression, Again, it was an opinion thing, but if Paul had everybody, all of the workers circumcised that had not been, it very well then would have done the opposite. So timing. And it goes back to what Michelle is asking. The timing is important in reference to how to deal with certain situations and not... we've always got to do what's right. But we also have to be concerned with things of opinion that we don't, cause more problems than it's worth. And there's times not to do certain things because it would give the wrong impression. There are other times that doing what we do, we realize that regardless of the impression, this is what we've got to do. Interesting. Very interesting, I think. Anybody else with a thought there? Okay. We find that when they left Lystra, notice verse 4. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. And of course, that had a great deal to do with circumcision. So what they were doing, as they were going through these new congregations, as they were continuing on into the synagogues to preach and teach, they were delivering this letter, these decrees that had been made, and establishing hopefully more and more the principle that had been taught there. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily, verse 5. So more and more Gentiles are being brought in. More and more Jews are making this transition as well. Now when they'd gone through Perga, verse 6, and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. They had established several congregations in Asia, but they had not been to Europe as of yet. And these next few verses that simply deal with that. Paul, I guess, had mapped out his direction, and we find that God stepped in and basically changed that, desiring that they go a different direction, as the Holy Spirit forbade them from preaching more in Asia. Of course, that's where Ephesus was located, and other places where congregations had already been established. Well, the only way left for them to go was sort of northeast, which they did, and they came to Mysia and came down to Troas, a city located to the northwest corner of Asia Minor on the Aegean Sea. And Paul's, again, had a thought, and again he was overridden in a vision as to which way that they were going. And maybe when they were at Troas, Paul's thinking, okay, can't go this way, can't go this way. What does God want? So this vision that he had, a man of Macedonia, verse 9, said, come over to Macedonia and help us. Paul doesn't tell us how he knew that the man was a man of Macedonia. Maybe it was his dress. We don't know. But Paul, somehow, it was revealed to him, or he recognized where this man was from. So, the company was ready to go to Macedonia, which was situated in Europe. And I don't know if you've got a map in the back, like I do, but, a lot of Bibles have a map, and it'll have a little red line that maybe was the first journey, and then a little blue line is the second journey, and a little green line is the third journey. It's kind of interesting to look at where they stopped at some of the same places, the way that they took, the way that they went back. But you can see the difference between journey 1 and then journey number 2. Also in verse 10, and after he had seen the vision, immediately endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them. And notice he said, for us. Luke now joins the group. Up to this point, he had been talking about what they did. Now Luke joins the party. He joins the group. And so you'll find that those little pronouns are going to be different from this point forward. And of course, Macedonia, part of the Macedonian area was the city of Philippi, and this is where they met Lydia. And one of the things that we noticed was that there was no synagogue there. It took 10 Jewish men, or 10 Jewish men that were heads of 10 families, in order to establish a synagogue. There evidently was a Jewish population here, but not one significant enough to have a synagogue. So these ladies were praying down by the river, and they evidently were faithful enough to do that. We don't know what they were praying about. Maybe they were praying for God to send the truth to them. But Paul and Silas learned about it. They went down to the river, and it was there that they did their preaching and teaching to this good lady. It says they did this on the Sabbath day, verse 13. And the river was a place that was customary for prayer. This went all the way back to the Babylonian captivity under old Nebuchadnezzar. The river, and I don't know why that became a significant place, but the Jews would find a place where they could pray, where they could worship. And many times it was a riverside, a river location. This particular river is Gertites or Gartites is the river that's there. And it's about that all we know about that. Verse 14, a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was about 300 miles from home. She was from Thyatira. She was a seller of purple. It was a dye that was made from certain shells of the sea, and it was very expensive. Only the wealthy could afford this type of thing. So this is a lady that is a businesswoman. She was willing to travel. At the same time, she was not neglecting her worship to God. And she and others that worked with her, family and workers, were there worshiping. And Paul preached to them. It says the Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. So her heart was opened by the preaching and the teaching of God's Word. It wasn't a miraculous thing. But God opened their heart the same way He opened yours and mine. By the truth being preached. And we came to the realization that we were sinners. And we responded. So she heeded. She did what Paul told her. She repented of her sins. She was baptized into Jesus Christ. Verse 13 says, when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, come into my house. And she had to talk them into it. Maybe a group of men moving in where a group of ladies were living. But Paul was persuaded, and she persuaded them, and thus they stayed there for quite some time. Anybody with a thought? Comment there. The next section is a slave girl and the spirit that had possessed her. Again, there's several questions about that. It indicates that her owners, how they come to own a young lady, is interesting. She could predict the future, or at least they thought she could predict the future, and they were making money over that. It's interesting that it says in verse 18, she was following them around proclaiming that they were God's messengers. Did that for many days. Paul did not cast out the Holy Spirit immediately, the evil spirit rather, immediately. Maybe he was trying to avoid doing that, but eventually says he was grieved, so he cast out this evil spirit. And the folks that were making money went to the city magistrates and didn't accuse them of what they had done, but accused them of doing things against the Romans, or teaching things. The Romans had a law, and the law was that you could teach your own doctrine or your own religion and hold it, but you couldn't proselyte. In other words, if we went there, we could worship as we saw fit, but we couldn't go out here and try to get our neighbors to join us. Well, that's what they accused them of spreading the religion of the Jews to other people, which was against the law. That wasn't the problem. The problem was they were losing money. And this is how Paul and Silas ended up in jail. A lie being told, they were whipped, they were beaten, and then the earthquake and so forth and so on. We'll stop right there and try to touch on some of this and finish up a little bit more, maybe not so much in chapter 17. Anybody with a thought, comment? Appreciate you being here this morning.
Reach out and touch the Lord.